Welcome. In this video, we're going to step through the process of using PDFTK. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a some kind of file here. I'm going to open up Word. And we want something that we can essentially import into Acrobat, which we can then import into Acrobat Pro to create form fields, and then use that to import into RackForms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this file here on my desktop, and I'm going to call it name PDF. So something very simple here. And I'm going to save it as a PDF file. So we'll save this out, and we are essentially done with Word. Let me shrink this up a little bit here so we can see this. So here's my PDF. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, and I'm going to open with Acrobat Pro. So Acrobat Pro then is needed because I'm going to convert this into an acro form. So right now it's just a raw PDF with some text information, but doesn't have any form fields on it. So we need to add form fields before we can actually convert it. So I'm going to scroll down to Forms, and I'm going to click Create right here. And I'm just going to use the default options. And when it's done, it's going to now give me the ability to add new fields. So I'm going to add a text field, and I'm going to scroll this guy over, and I'm going to call it name. Now this thing that I've just done right here is really, really important. Basically, I need to make sure that the value that I'm using right here is going to match the value in RackForms. And so giving my form fields good names is really important. The reason why this is also important is we may find that in older forms, legacy forms, we may not actually have good names on our form fields. They'll be just kind of random values that the program put in there, like JX01 or something. So we really want to make sure that we go in, double click in the elements if they're existing form items, and give them good names, or if they are items that we're creating, that we give them good names. I'm going to make sure that I have a border color here just so it's a little bit easier to see. Generally speaking, this isn't necessary to actually have a border width, but again, just for the sake of demonstration, I want to make sure that I can see it. So I have a form field called name. I'm going to save this now, overwriting the original file. So I have name PDF. So I'm just going to replace that. So far so good. So I'm going to go ahead and close Acrobat. Now we're done with that. So now I have a PDF called name PDF that has one form field right here. And again, this, by the way, is why sometimes you don't want to use the outlines. You saw we had some weird behavior right there, even in Apple's default PDF option. So anyway, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this PDF file, and I'm going to just show you something real quick here, that we can actually take this and build a form in RackForms from it. So I'm going to click the form wizard, which is this icon right here, and I'm just going to drag and drop this PDF file onto that box right there. Now what it's going to do is it's going to take this form, and it's going to create a representation of that form as a web form for me. So you can see here that I have my text and my form field. Now, importantly, RackForms has taken that name value that we entered in Acrobat, and it's imported it as the name value of my form field right here. So this is why in our documentation, we usually suggest that if you have an existing form, that you drag and drop it into RackForms like this, because we have to make sure that our name in RackForms matches the name as we put it in Acrobat. So very, very important. Now, in this case, the form is simple enough to where I could have just added this field and added the name manually, right? Because I know it's capital N-A-M-E, right? Could have done that myself, but again, with larger forms, this is probably the easiest way to do it. The reason why this is an issue in the first place, though, is generally speaking, an Acrobat form is not appropriate for web consumption, right? It doesn't resize appropriately. It's not a responsive form. And so generally speaking, we are going to want to refactor the form so it makes sense for the web, right? So it can be filled out on mobile devices. So very important that we, at very minimum, if we do nothing else, we make sure that our form field names match what's going to be in the Acrobat file. Okay, so hopefully I haven't pounded that point to death here. Let's kind of move on. So I have now a form that has a single field called name. In order to make this right to an existing PDF, I'm going to add a submission page. Well, actually, let me add a submit button first, just so we can actually submit this form. And now I'm going to add a submission page. And to the submission page, I'm going to add any of the submission items that I want, like I can write this to the database, send an email, but I'm going to make sure that I add PDFTK to this. And this is going to actually handle our PDFTK processing. Now, the other thing I have to do is configure the PDFTK module. There's only a few things that we actually care about. So in this particular case, I want to make sure that's enabled. It is by default. And then I'm going to put in the name of my PDF file. So you'll notice right here it's called name_pdf.pdf. So that's what I want to call this file. What's essentially going to happen is when I save this, the PDFTK process is going to open this file. It's going to read its contents, and then it's going to populate any of the matching form field values that have the same name with the values that we filled in the form. Then, after that's done, it's either going to give us a download prompt where I can download that PDF, or we can send it as an email attachment. In this case, I'll leave it as a download prompt. Okay, so at this point, our form is done. I'll go ahead and save this, and I now have, let me shrink this down here, I have a form called output forms name, and then I have a page called page 0. So now what we want to do is we want to move into a Windows box. So first I'm going to open up my documents folder. I'm going to go into my HD Docs RackForms output folder, and I'm going to find that form. And so we called it name. So there's our form right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this job onto my Windows server right here. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe just move this over. And I'm going to take the name folder and I'm just going to drag and drop it onto my Windows machine. And so there it appears. I'm also going to take this PDF and drag it on here as well, because again, part of this PDFTK process is it's going to want this PDF file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag name PDF in here. And the reason I'm going to do that is if we look back in RackForms, we've essentially said that there's going to be a file called name_pdf.pdf in my job folder. So this is, in other words, kind of a relative path. If it was in a folder, I would do something like, PDFs, and maybe do that, right? And that would say essentially that I have a folder called PDFs, right? And then the PDF would be located in there. In this case, though, I don't. It's just on the root of the job. So let me go ahead and just make sure it's set to name. Okay, so now that we have this essentially set up right here, I would of course need to place this job somewhere where it can actually run. So I've just kind of put this on my desktop, but of course I don't actually have any jobs there. So I'm going to go into my C drive here, and I'm going to go into my inotpub www.root folder, and I'm going to go into maybe my RackForms folder right here. And maybe I'll go to output forms, and now I'll drag name in there. So now what I should be able to do is I should be able to, on my PC here again, navigate to this folder. So I believe I have a server called dev here. Looks like Firefox, of course, is updating as it's wont to do. So let's just try dev, and let's just see if I can go into this name form. Now again, what we're seeing here is essentially specific to my current configuration. And hopefully that makes sense, of course, because this is what I've actually done for this server. Obviously, your paths are going to be a little bit different. So, okay, at this point then, we have brought up the form, and you'll notice again it looks very similar to the PDF. And so let's just try this. Let me put in Matt here and hit submit. And now I get a submission page, and I get, as you recall here, a download prompt, right? So it's saying, well, I have a download for you. Let's go ahead and open this. And if all went well here, we will now have a PDF file that opens with that name value pre-filled. And you can see, sure enough, here it is. So this now is, again, a raw PDF file, but now the value that we filled out in our form is actually using that value Matt right there. So that is the basic PDFTK workflow. Now again, on our documentation page, we actually have a link to the PDFTK software. It is free, luckily. And the installation process, especially on Windows, is actually quite easy. I imagine it's probably a deb package or something like that on Linux. On Mac, the reason why I don't have it on my Mac is because it was a big, complicated process, and I wasn't interested in doing that. So the Windows installer was just easier. But there's zero configuration. On my Windows machine, I just double-clicked, and it installed, and it is now just a process that runs on this machine, which RackForms will use to generate PDFs. The last and closing point here that I want to make is that in this particular case, we just populated a form field, right? Just a simple text field. This process is going to be a little bit more difficult if we have things like radio items. So RackForms does support things like dropdowns and radio items, but it's probably safest to stick with simple text fields, right? So if we have a bunch of like file uploads or conditional radio items or checkboxes, it's probably best to stick with not trying to do this because it can lead to problems, right? Like Acrobat is a very complex language. The RackForms fields are maddeningly complex, and they can lead to all sorts of weird things if we don't have everything configured properly. So generally speaking, it's probably best to just make your target for simple text fields with this process. It is possible to do radio items to checkboxes, but it is more difficult. So keep that in mind as you move forward. And of course, if you have any questions, just let us know. But there you go. There is the simple PDF TK process for RackForms.